Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been going through the life of Moses. We can learn a lot from Moses. And we are presently in chapter 4 and chapter 5 and so on. And I think we can also often fit for a title today, how about to mountaintop to deep ravine? Have you ever done that? A mountaintop experience to crash to a deep ravine? Having taken a few mission trips, I've often seen in my own life that you are on a mountaintop when you come back and had a great experience, and you go into a deep ravine afterward. And that can be due for a lot of things. It could be just exhaustion. When you get back, it can be that others don't respond to you the way you think they should about your trip. It could be getting back into the daily routine. And I think the question can be, is it a common experience? And I think that it is. But I think, how can we handle this going from mountaintop to deep ravine? Is there something we can learn? I think you're going to find that with Moses as well. He goes from a mountaintop to a deep ravine very, very quickly in one chapter. So let's look at his mountaintop experience. First of all, we saw it a little bit last week. We'll look at it in Exodus chapter 4. And you'll notice, starting in verse 27 down to 31, his mountaintop experience, Exodus 4, 27 to 31. First of all, he has Aaron's going to come. So now the Lord said to Aaron, "Go meet Moses in the wilderness." So he went and met him at the mountain of God, and he kissed him. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders, sons of Israel. So notice, Aaron was obedient to the Lord. He went. Moses had a great reunion. When you think about it, how long had it been since they've seen each other? And you think about it, they're 3 years older, Aaron is, according to the next chapter. And he left, and you think about how many years that's been. And you also notice the role. Moses then told Aaron also that what the role was going to be, that he was going to speak to Aaron, and Aaron was going to speak to Pharaoh. And how would you like to be that? You get a nice reunion, you come and meet your brother. Hey, by the way, I'm going to tell you what to say, and you're going to tell Pharaoh. Ready? Let's go.
Sure. Yeah.
You ready to go? You notice also the elders. The elders were assembled of leaders of Israel. In verse 30, Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs. If you remember, there's 3 of them. What were the 3 signs? You remember? You remember this? You throw the rod down and become a snake. He put his hand in and become leprous, put it back in, and then turning the water also. So the people believed when they heard what the Lord saw it, and then also what the Lord had told them, that he was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction. They bowed down and worshiped. So think about mountain high. Aaron comes, he's going to do his part. They go to the elders, they present all the miracles. They see it, the miracles, they believe, they hear about God, and they stoop and worship. Would you call that a mountaintop experience? Everything's going just according to plan. I think, how do you respond when everything's going your way? You notice it's interesting, they stooped to worship. Right there, they stopped to worship. It's a good place to start. I think a lot of times things are going well in our life, and we never stop. We just assume that's what it ought to be. The stoop and worship. And notice then we have the deep ravines. And are they inevitable? And can I prepare for them? Some good questions. First of all, it was prophesied. Notice in verse 21, back in chapter 4. The Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh, all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I'll harden his heart, so he will not let the people go." Now, how would you feel? I'm going back, I'm going to do all these miracles, and Pharaoh's not going to let them go. And your question would probably be what? Why do it? What about in John 16 and verse 33? What did Jesus tell us? I give you peace, but in the world you'll have trouble. He prophesied that, but I am with you. James chapter 1 and verse 2, consider it all what?
Joy.
When you encounter various troubles, not if, when. 1 Peter chapter 1, same thing. You are going to have trials. It's interesting, he says, for a little while. What's a little while? You think about it. You look at eternity, our life is very little. So stop and think about it. It's prophesied. So, we know that we're going to have troubles. He knew he was going to have troubles. He was ready for that part. You can see it now. It's in verse 5, chapter 5, verse 1 to 5. It was prophesied and he was planning for these. Prepared. After Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast for me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and besides I won't let Israel go. If you remember, they had gods of Egypt, and Pharaoh was considered a god. He was the incarnate of the god Ray. So, heck, if he's such a great God, why are we rulers and you are slaves? And notice he then said in verse 3, then he said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey in the wilderness, and we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said to him, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their labors? Get back to your labor. Okay, is it all going according to plan? Well, it is. Did he not say, you're going to go, and I'm going to harden his heart, and he's not going to let you go? So everything's going according to plan. I think it's interesting. But now you're getting ready for the unplanned, the unprepared. Everything's going like, similar to what they were told. But now they're getting ready for a part that won't be. And by the way, did Moses and Aaron do their part? Did God do his part? And did Pharaoh do his part? Everything's going according to plan. But notice then the welcome part. Notice then, starting in verse 5. Again Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are many, and you would have them cease from their labors. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters, who would be Egyptians, over the people, and their foremen, which you're ready to read would be Hebrews, saying, you are no longer to give the people straw to make bricks as previous. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously, you shall impose upon them. You shall not reduce any of it, because they're lazy. Therefore they cried out, let us go worship God. What's unplanned? He's now taking the straw away. We're not going to bring the straw to you. You now have to go to the fields and get the straw, but the quota is the same. None of them were prepared for this response. You stop and think about it. Just give you a little something to think about. We're going through this, so you all will probably forget the rest of the message thinking of the answer. When was D-Day supposed to actually occur? When did it occur, and when was it supposed to occur, and why was it postponed?
Supposed to happen a little bit earlier, but they had bad weather.
There you go. It's supposed to have happened. They were wanting to do it. 3 requirements. They wanted a full moon. They wanted the rising tide, and just before dawn. So they had a date in May. They couldn't do it because of logistics. You got them in June. They also had one in the middle of June, which wouldn't have been full moon, but it turned out to be the worst storm in 40-year history of the Atlantic. And then also in July 3rd to July 5th. The hard part, the longer you wait, how do you hide 156,000 men? How do you hide all the ships and all the planes? The longer you wait, the harder it is to do it. But they did postpone it because of one young lady. Marie Felt. What did she have to say and what caused them to stop? And why did they postpone it? All right, give you something to think about. I'll give you later. Okay, notice then, so what happened is circumstances changed. And notice then what happens with the taskmasters. You go down a little bit later, In verse 9, let the labor be heavier on the men and let them work, and they may not pay attention. We're going to make it so hard they aren't going to listen to anything being said. Verse 10, the taskmasters of the people and their foremen went out and spoke to the people, saying, thus says Pharaoh, I'm not going to give you straw anymore. Go out and get straw for yourselves wherever you find, but none of your labors will be reduced. So the people scattered throughout all the land of Egypt to gather the stubble for straw. And the taskmasters pressed them, saying, complete your work quota, your daily amount you must, just as before. 14, moreover, the foremen of the sons of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beating them, were asking, why have you not completed your requirement either yesterday or today? So would you say things went from bad to worse? Okay, so notice, I think it's interesting where their eyes were. Their eyes were on the circumstances. Second thing, their eyes are on the people's response. Notice what happens. You go a little bit, they claim they're lazy and the rest, so notice what happens then in verse 20 and 21. When they left Pharaoh, talking about the foreman, the Jewish foreman, when they left Pharaoh's presence, they met Moses and Aaron as they were waiting for him. Who's not going to get the blame? Who's the one that went to Pharaoh? Who's the one that started it? So everybody's going to blame him. And notice what they say. They said to them, may the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you have made us odious in Pharaoh's sight and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword to the hands to kill us. So notice, first of all, what changed? Circumstances changed. People's responses changed. And then the third thing that changed, what about with Moses? 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why hast thou brought harm to this people? Why didst thou ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he has done harm to this people, and thou hast not delivered thy people at all. Unplanned, unprepared. What changed? Circumstances changed. People's responses changed. And also then short-sighted. Moses' eyes were on who? Circumstances, people, himself. Nothing's changed. Any of you ever felt like that at times? What happened, if you get back to the story, there's Ireland stayed in neutral in World War II, but they had 5 meteorologist stations, lighthouses. Ravine and her family gave weather reports every hour on the hour. The barometric pressure dropped greatly, the storm was coming. They're on the west coast of Ireland. Storms would come from that direction and go across. It said you're going to have a great, great storm headed your way. The reports started going up the channels. Gets to Eisenhower, and June the 4th, he postponed the invasion of June 5th. June 4th, she gives the report, and others, her parents and so on. And her future husband was the lighthouse keeper. Gave the report, weather is clearing. So they knew the next day it would be clear in Normandy, at a full moon, all the requirements. They invaded on June 6th at the full moon. In fact, it was interesting, JFK at his inauguration in 1961, replacing Dwight Eisenhower, asked Dwight Eisenhower, why were you successful on D-Day? What do you think Eisenhower's response was? We had better meteorologists than Germans did. That's interesting. How many of us would have believed the report? But you have that many men going, that's so important. How many would have been lost at sea in the middle of the storm? So I think it's important. Unplanned, but they were prepared. But how many of us are unplanned, or different things that happen in our life, and we're also unprepared? They were not prepared when the circumstances changed. They were not prepared when people turned against them. They were not prepared to stay the long term with the Lord. Let's see what we can do then, and how we can change that. Unplanned, but being prepared. Let's see if we can change it. Chapter 6. I want you to notice in chapter 6, the first one, release and recognize whose problem is it. I want you to notice in we'll read verse 1, and then I want you to look at several verses and look at some repeating words. Then the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For under compulsion he will let you go, and under compulsion he will drive you out of the land. Now we know he does that later. Does God have a plan? Yes, we have to trust the plan. But notice, I think it's interesting, in verse 2, you'll find it again in verse 6, you'll find it again in verse 7, find it again in verse 8. What does God keep repeating? I am the God who will take care of this. So your eyes need to be where? On Him. Notice what you're also going to find in verse 1, verse 6, verse 7, verse 8. You also had it in 29. He says, I will do these things. How many of us are always worried? Our eyes are not on God, and we're not thinking about what He will do. If He says He will do something. By the way, don't we have a lot of promises? I'll never what? Leave you or
Forsake you.
okay, cast all your cares on Him or okay. We have promises too. They were given promises, but they took their eyes off of God. So I think the first one is release and recognize whose problem it is. If you keep going, notice He'll tell you in verse 3. In verse 2, God spoke further to Moses and said, I am the Lord, which I said, He mentions that in 2, 6, 7, and 8, as well as 29. Notice He said in verse 3, And I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob as the God Almighty. By my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. And I have established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. All right? The covenant. I made a promise they're going to have it. He also said way back in Genesis 15, you'll be in captivity for 430 years. And you're going to come out with many possessions. It's not time to leave. Later in the book of Exodus, it's interesting. It says they leave on exactly the very day of 430 years later. You think God has a plan. But when they're in the middle of it, they took their eyes on what they need to be. So the first one is to release and recognize whose problem it is. How many times do we try to make the problem our own? I've got to solve it. Notice the second thing. I think it's interesting. You find this in 5:23, and then also in 6:8. 5:23 we already read. But ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he has done harm to this people, and thou hast not delivered thy people at all. And then you'll notice also you find it in verse 8. I'll bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So we need to notice second thing, restrict our vision off of circumstances and put them solely on God. Take it off our circumstances. When you think about it, I think that's what's so hard. I'll give you some examples, for instance, off of circumstances. What about Peter? In Matthew 14, you remember Jesus walking on water. They're in the boat, storm's great. Peter says what? If it's you, Lord, what?
Let me come to you.
Bid me to come. Which I have to admire Peter. If I was would you have got out of the boat? None of the others did either. Now Peter gets out of the boat and says he was walking on water just fine until when? And looked at his circumstances. And obviously you're seeing waves like they would be having in the middle of that storm that seasoned fishermen are scared about. He started to sink. He was fine when his eyes were on Jesus. When he looks at circumstances, he starts to fail. Notice the next part. So we have to release and recognize whose problem it is. Restrict our vision off of circumstances and onto God. Notice the next one in verse 9 down through verse 12 of 6. Moses spoke thus to the sons of Israel. They did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and cruel bondage. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, Go tell Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to let the sons of Israel go out of his land. And Moses spoke before the Lord, saying, Behold, the sons of Israel have not listened to me. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? I'm unskilled in speech. I think the third thing then is how many of us are restricting our vision away from others and onto God? Hey, they didn't believe him. Why will Pharaoh believe him? And hey, I'm not that good. It's interesting, a good example. How many of you remember David when he went off and his men went off and they attacking the Philistines before he became king? And they were living in the town, if you remember, Ziklag, Ziklag. And the Amalekites came in and captured the women, the children, and all their possessions. So when the men all come back, where are their wives? Where are their children? Gone. So what do? They turn against who?
David.
And they want to stone him. And if you were those men's positions, you went and left your family because who told you to? And what does it say in verse 6 of chapter 30? David encouraged himself in the Lord. He turned to the Lord, and the Lord then told him to pursue, which, by the way, most of us would have pursued immediately. We wouldn't stop to talk to the Lord. He pursued. He said, okay, you'll capture everybody. Now, what's the chances of going and having 600 men, their wives, and all their children, and being able to go and capture every single one alive? Which is what they did. Because David's eyes were on what? And his men and his soldiers eyes were on what? So what happens, that's what so many of us get. Our eyes, get off of God and onto our circumstances, onto the response of other people, and everything else. Notice the next one I think is interesting. You also have, you go a little bit further, notice in verse, we saw that in verse 13, but we also notice when you go over to verse 28 of this chapter, and through the first part of chapter 7. Now, it came about on the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I am the Lord. Speak to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, all that I speak to you. When Moses said before him, behold, I am unskilled in speech. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? Isn't that the same problem he had when he was back in Midian? Hey, I'm not good with words. I can't convince him. Was Moses ever sent there to convince him? Chapter 7, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron will speak to Pharaoh, and he'll let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs, my wonders in the lands of Egypt. Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I'll lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. So Aaron and Moses did all that God commanded. We need to restrict our vision away from ourselves and onto God. When we look at ourselves, how capable are we? But is God capable? And I think when we allow God to use us and God gets the credit, great things can happen. So the unprepared part, you think about it, do we release and recognize whose problem it is? It's not my problem. Lord, I give it to you. A good example of that, remember Hezekiah? Remember they had the city all surrounded by the great army, Sennacherib, the greatest army of that day? And he just lays it out before God in the letter and says, there's nothing we can do. This is your city, you're going to have to do something about it. And he does. We need to restrict our vision off of circumstances and onto God. They're looking at circumstances. It's harder to do the bricks. They've all turned away from us. They're not listening to us. God, you're doing that. Any of you ever thought God wasn't moving fast enough for you? Maybe it's better to say, when has God ever moved fast enough for you? The third one, restricting our vision away from others and their responses. If you wait till everybody is lined up responding the way you want them to, when it happens, it'll only happen for a very short period of time. As soon as circumstances change, they'll change. Redirect our vision away from ourselves and onto God. You realize that Marie did not even know, and then later her husband Tim did not even know that their report changed the course of D-Day until 1956. 12 years later, they finally were told about their report. Marie was 98 years of age in 2021 before she finally got an award from the United States House of Representatives when she was 98 in a nursing home for her service in saving so many men. And she died last year at the age of 100. But notice she was not trying to get recognition. She's doing her job. But how many of us are willing to accept a report like that to change all that? They changed the invasion based on a report that many miles away. So again, I think we can look at it. Are we going to have mountaintops? Sure. Are we going to have some valleys? Plan for the valleys, but when they're unplanned and come unprepared, we can prepare by living those four things. Recognizing it's God's problem. It's like Mueller, he's taking care of the orphans. No food. And what does he tell the orphans to do? Let's pray and thank the Lord for the food. What food do they have? Nothing. And when they open their eyes, there's a knock on the door, and who's there?
The baker.
The baker, and you have the milkman, and they break down, and the milk's going to go bad, and everything else. Do you have any use for this? The right time. Restrict our vision away from circumstances. Restrict our vision away from others. What did you stop and think? What did Peter do in John 21 to 20? When God tells him, that Christ tells him the kind of death he's going to have, immediately Peter turns to John and says, "What about him?" And what does Jesus say? Don't worry about him, you follow me. Most of us look at other people. How well things are going for them, or they're not going through this, or whatever it might be. The last one, I think, that's obviously getting away from ourselves. We don't, Moses did so much when he realized he couldn't do it. When he was 40, he tried to deliver them and he failed. When he doesn't think he can do it and rely on God, great things happen. And we can do the same.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.